Okay, hi. My name is Joan-Josep Vallbé, and he's my colleague Balázs Bodó, and we're presenting the results of a paper on the framework of a project on alternatives to copyright, or the exploration of alternative compensation systems in the age of access. And as I said, this is a brief summary of our results of a paper. You have it linked on the program, and you can access some of the or all of the details. Just to set the ground, what we mean by compensation system is what is generally understood as alternative compensation system is a kind of a license to endow the rights to users to download and use digital content in return for a fee, right? Our main research question on this paper and in the whole project, in the project we actually explored legal feasibility, social acceptance and economic consequences. By social acceptance we mean public preferences, and by economic consequences we mean also welfare effects of the implementation of such compensation system based on the Dutch market. Our main research question in this paper is there a single, either voluntary or mandatory kind of license or compensation system that in exchange for a monthly fee or for any kind of fee would legalize current copyright infringement, non-commercial use of content that is legally feasible and economically sensible. To carry out these, or to explore the research question, we should first identify the main factors that affect or may affect public acceptance on such a compensation system. How much would be citizens willing to pay for such a system or a kind of a license? And if so, if they would participate, or at what rate or to what extent would they participate in such a system? There have been other studies in this field exploring similar things, but these studies often have found or tested only a very limited number of compensation systems, and they have found or come up with some overestimation in the calculation of the willingness to pay by the users. We found a way to overcome some of these limitations, although we didn't, of course, we're not sure that we overcame the whole set of limitations of this kind of studies, but we designed a discrete choice experiment with a very large sample of Dutch citizens over 16 years old. The sample is almost 5,000 people, with a quite complex design of experiment in which people were presented with different options or bundles or types of compensation systems, and they would choose the one that they most prefer, or they would just say none of this is preferred by me. So the thing, or the main attributes, the main components of this discrete choice experiment is that we designed a kind of compensation system that would have 6 different attributes. The first one is what we called allowed users, and we presented 3 different levels of allowed users: just download content, download and share content, and download, share, and modify content. So it's such a kind of incremental way or ordinal order of the attribute. The second one is the subject matter, in which we presented 3 different options as well. The first one is just you would be able to download or whatever with music. The second one includes music and movies or films, and the third one would include music, films, and books. The third attribute is about the catalog completeness. So what is the extent of the existing stuff online that you would be able to access? So the complete catalog of the artists, or you would have different kinds of limitations. You would have just an incomplete catalog, or you would have only a temporally accessible catalog. The fourth of the attributes is regarding the monitoring or the monitorization of the usage, internet usage. So either users would be anonymously monitorized by the use, or there would be like an express statement on the fact that no monitoring would exist. The fifth of the attributes is regarding how much of the revenues would the artist get, or whether there would be a fixed amount, in particular 50% of the revenues would go to the artists, or the artist should be absolutely free to freely negotiate their share with the other part. And the final one, obviously, is the price. 6 price levels, from 5 euros at the minimum to 30 euros at the maximum. On top of that, our whole sample was divided in 6 different scenarios, in which we randomly assigned people to each of these scenarios regarding the kind of or the way that people would pay the price. So in one scenario, people would pay just a flat rate, and in the second one, people would pay as they use. And in the second type of the scenarios, we would have 3 different kinds of participation. In the first one, participation will be mandatory, so everyone with an internet subscription would pay a fee. The second one would be a voluntary participation, obvious. And the third one, we introduced this kind of middle ground, like a voluntary participation, but with strict enforcement. Okay, so we had 6 different scenarios in which people were randomly selected. This is a picture of the kind of choice set that each respondent would face 12 times. Okay? So each respondent was faced 12 times, or with 12 different combinations of alternatives. And as you see, each of the choice sets has a non-option. So the ability of the user to say none of these are satisfying. Okay? And with different combinations of each of the 6 attributes. Of course, combining all of the attributes would yield almost 650 different alternatives, and this is not feasible for a 5,000 sample. So we selected 89 different alternatives plus the non-option, which makes up 90 different alternatives. And we derived from this the calculation of how much people would be willing to trade the different attributes in their preferred compensation systems. I will skip the details, don't run away, because I will not get into this. But this is only to show that these are the results of the coefficients showing the marginal utility that the average marginal utility that respondents would have from each of the combinations of the attributes with respect to a reference category in the 6 different scenarios. This is just to show that no major changes occurred in any of the different combinations of scenarios. So people didn't show radical changes or shifts in their average utility that they would get from one or the other scenarios. The top row is the 3 different options with a flat rate, and the bottom row shows the utility they would get in the 3 different participation types under the pay-as-you-use. Okay, so as you can see, just regardless of what they actually mean, is that the figures more or less look the same. From these results, though, we can derive more interesting calculations, which is, on average, what would people be willing to pay for each attribute with respect to a reference category? How do we interpret these numbers? These are the 6 different attributes, and these are the 3, for instance, in the allowed users attribute, we have the 3 different levels. So music is the reference level. What we can see here is that, on average, people would be willing to pay 8.7 euros more to have the ability to download music and films instead of only music. But they would only be willing to pay 6.2 euros on average more to have music, films, and books than just to have music. Okay. In the sorry, I just flipped the attributes. This is my mistake. So the first 3 levels correspond to the subject matter, and these 3 levels correspond to allowed uses. You see that, okay? So I'm sorry, but the numbers are okay. So the thing is that people, when we presented that, the results yield like kind of a strange thing in the sense that people do not value, on average, do not value more the ability to share stuff instead of just downloading. The results show that download plus share, so the ability to download and share, people would be willing to pay 3 euros on average less than just being able to download. And when we add modification to the rights, to the allowed uses of content, the results show a higher negative effect. Regarding the catalog completeness, the reference here is the restricted catalog, and people would be able to pay, would be willing to pay a little bit more for having more things, either if they are temporarily restricted or either if they are the full catalog. Regarding the monitoring thing, there's no radical change, although the difference is a bit negative. So they would rather have no monitoring than to have an anonymous monitoring. And regarding the artist's compensation, people would prefer that no guaranteed share for the artist would be set up by the system. Okay. This is average results. Apart from the conclusions that we could come up with regarding these results in terms of the economic analysis that we will going to present right now, other paths open up for us of research in terms of how do, so are there like specific groups of citizens that have specific kind of preferences, or for instance, is age a high factor influencing these results, or is education, or is income, or things like that, are these kind of variables affecting these results? This is something that we are exploring right now, so we do not have yet some results. After this, we calculated the welfare effects of those results. So these are the public preferences in a representative sample of the Dutch citizenship. And then we can have, we can do some calculation of what would entail in the market in economic terms or welfare terms to implement one of those compensation systems. In our paper, we only focused on music. Okay, so we first derived from the results which was the most preferred alternative, or the alternative that was mostly preferred by the citizens, including only music. And this alternative was this one. On average, the most preferred, or the alternative that received most votes by the sample, including music only, implied the ability to download and share temporarily restricted catalog without any kind of monitoring and no guaranteed share for artists. And what we did with that was we just took this alternative and calculated what would happen in terms of the revenue for the rights holders and in terms of welfare. Considering constant initial figures regarding the net revenues of music rights holders, current net revenues in about 150 million euros, substitution effect of 100%, and knowing that there are 7.25 million households with internet in the Netherlands. this is just the results of the predicted probabilities of acceptance of that specific combination or alternative under the mandatory, the voluntary, and the voluntary with strict enforcement regarding our results. And you can see that there is no actual radical change either here in terms of the price sensitivity. So people more or less give the same results under the three different scenarios. The quantity, so regarding the, under the fixed payment option, so if we should apply a flat rate for a mandatory system of that combination of attributes, we would have a wide range of price regarding this flat rate. The minimum price, so the price that would fully compensate the current revenues for rights holders, would be 1.8 euros. And the average willingness to pay by users with this compensation system is 9.25 euros. So between these two figures, or at least since all of these studies suffer for some kind of, some measure of overestimation of the average willingness to pay, even if we just cut this by 1/3, because usually the overestimation is like 3 times, or by the overestimation is around a factor of 3. So, but if we just take 1/3 of this, we still have a wide range of options. Any price between 1.8 or 2 euros and 9.25 or 9 euros would make everyone better off. With the average, with the flat rate of the average willingness to pay by users, 9.25, the change in rights holder revenue would be 616 million euro, with the current revenues of 150 million. If the participation is voluntary and not mandatory, because this one was with the mandatory participation, obviously the price would go up. Okay, so the revenue maximizing price, or the price that should be applied to that compensation system to fully compensate the revenues of the rights holders, would be 23.4 euros, with a participation of about 23-24% of the citizenship. With this, the annual change in rights, this was the revenue maximizing price, so the revenues would still be higher up. It's not the fully compensation price, it's the revenue maximizing price. So the revenues would be, the change would be a little bit lower than the one that would get from the mandatory option, but still we could have a significant change, positive change in the revenues for the rights holders. So, concluding, there's room for finding a well-designed compensation system that makes everyone better off from our results. That's one of the strong conclusions of our study. If that compensation system is mandatory, it can maximize rights holders' revenues, because the participation would be massive. We do not expect, with a low price, with a flat rate, we wouldn't expect a strong effect on internet subscriptions. So the mandatory system would be highly maximizer. But even a voluntary competition system still yields a gain in rights holders' revenues by a factor at least of 3. So, but it has some drawbacks. It would have low participation. So copyright infringement would be likely, very likely, that would still occur in the market. So we need more data. That's the conclusion that social scientist always includes in a presentation. More data would be needed to gain better conclusion. But specifically, we would need cross-country comparisons to make a bigger picture of what we are exploring right now. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My conclusion would be poor artists and stupid people. You give them more and they want to pay less. But okay, if that's what they tell you, that's what they do. Dennis, you as a man from the music industry, your first comment, please.
Well, actually, what Derek already said, like, hilarious. You know, we should actually reform the business model of the music industry. When you're an artist or a rights holder, which is quite interesting actually, because my other background is digital strategy, and I'm talking of a lot of artists at the moment just to give away the music to get information from your fans and followers, so you can implement your earning models.
The more data you have, the more you can do with it.
This shows maybe it's the right direction.
Okay, well, so it was at least a good afternoon for you. Questions or remarks?
Yeah, I mean, I've already seen the results previously, and the not caring about a guaranteed share for the artist was the piece that shocked me, because I actually do the same thing as the judges of the Court of Justice. I'm not that old as them, but I still check things with my kids, who are the real digital natives in my house. And whilst the legal framework of copyright is impossible to explain to a 14-year-old, that's, privacy you can explain to them. There's lots of things online you can explain to them and they make sense out of it. But copyright, that's a bizarre thing to them. But when you say, well, don't you think that if you make music or you make a beautiful drawing and people use it elsewhere, shouldn't you be rewarded for that? That's actually about the only part they understand of copyright. You create something and you get reward, or at least recognition. The part of they say that beautiful drawing was from you. So I'm very. Do you have any factors explaining why that 50% share, guaranteed share?
The thing is that, well, actually, I don't know if
Yeah,
works. Okay. The thing is that the question was not whether they would receive anything or not. The question is whether they would have a 50% guaranteed, or they would have to freely negotiate their share with rights holders.
Do you think it was because they think they get more in another scenario? Because honestly,
I think
that's probably not reality.
So I think so. So we didn't inform the respondents about the actual share that that individual rights holders receive vis-a-vis institutional rights holders. So we didn't tell them whether that's 20% or 40% or 80%. And for me, this knowing that it's well below 50% the individual rights holders share in many cases, for me this results points as a serious PR problem for individual rights holders, that they need to do more to explain that they are being abused by the current system and they don't receive a fair share of the revenues. And that's an important thing, because I also believe that might be a very important driver for any policy action. The consumer or user support for equitable remuneration regarding individual rights holders vis-a-vis big US recording companies, right?
Andreas?
How can you explain that people were willing to pay less when they were able to download more categories with the e-books?
Okay, I think if we give them even newspapers with it, they were willing to pay even less.
Yeah, exactly. Was that some psychology in people, or is that maybe some flaw in the reason?
No, they're willing to pay more than just music. They are willing to pay more to have books included than just to have music, but they are not willing to pay as much as just having music and movies. So it's not that they're willing to pay. Sorry.
So there's a diminishing returns of adding extra categories of content. So
exactly. So
those people who read books, who prefer to have books in their portfolio, might have a lower value associated with having films, because they watch less films and read more, right? So if we don't know how that value is being distributed, that's €6 value compared to the €8 value, but we can say that most probably films, for those who want to have books, have value less than €8, because they watch less TV or they watch less movies, and they spend time reading instead.
And is the method of consuming all this content, was it presented in a sort of in an abstract way, or like a sort of Spotify client or a Netflix client, or just download from anywhere you can find? What is it?
We didn't specify that because that was not our question. Our main question was, and that's something that I kept hearing in this discussion, is that we felt the need to include the user's opinion in policy research, which is quite rarely done, because as is the topic of this discussion is, how do we create a system, a policy, which is able to create these necessary incentives in the copyright system. But this whole problem that we have to solve now is wrapped inside the millions of those users who either go and buy a Spotify account or go and use the Pirate Bay. But so far this problem that any policy that is able to solve the riddle of incentives has to be approved by the actual users who always have to choose to go to the Pirate Bay or not to buy the Spotify account, has not been addressed. So this was our first approach, to make sure that the user's opinion is heard, because if they don't approve a policy, there will be this gap between the reality and the law, and the point is to close that gap, right? And the second point was to put a price tag on inaction, and that was your question, right? That how much does it cost that we stick to the status quo? We know how much under this very specific assumption the cost of inaction is. It costs hundreds of millions of euros every year, both in terms of consumer welfare and in terms of lost revenues for certain rights holders. So when it comes to assessing the actual value of this research, is that it's a very strong evidence of an alternative that is not just welfare increasing for each and every stakeholder in this game, but it also enjoys the support of the consumer, of the user, who has to foot the bill and has to pay the price that solves the creativity incentive problem. So, and it leads down to a number of interesting questions, like what is the demand for books? How valid is this remix ideology in practice when you see people are not really willing to pay for modification rights, right? So what is, and also the lag of the project that we haven't presented here is the legal feasibility of having an ACS. And the colleague who did the legal analysis was very confident that this can be done even within the existing legal framework with certain restrictions. So there is a way forward, and that would be our message, a very promising way forward.